The art of making a sequel can lead down many different avenues, and with varying degrees of evolution in separate categories. Making a new entry that is radically different from before, or making it so it improves previously established conventions and features isn't mutually exclusive. Of course, Chicken Invaders 2 is a case where a deep look really isn't necessary, as it's a sequel in the more traditional sense to an already fairly simple prospect. It's taking what worked in the first game and simply giving much more of it, continuing on the same base and building on it in order to unleash the untapped potential with the help of hindsight. The same gameplay loop of blasting down barrages of poultry in the vast, expansive space is the sole attraction, with it remaining just as much of an absurd premise as it started off as. Most aspects of the original title have been upgraded, on top of just how much more of a substantial game this is. A whopping 110 waves of enemies that constantly change between numerous flying patterns alongside multiple bosses, 3 different upgradable weapons, several different cutscenes, way more sources for extra points, the ability to move up and down instead of only horizontally, and the list only goes on. It's taken steps forward from being close to a joke game that now feels like a respectable piece of work that's been fully finished and doesn't lack substance, besides the absence of music most of the time. It can leave the game feeling a tad empty. In terms of being a complete product, this feels a surprising amount like the great titles PopCap once produced, charming in its own right and not coming off as if any of its aspects were underdeveloped or compromised. As a follow-up, it's one of the best sequels I've seen to any game, and I mean this sincerely. The numerous extras and expansions came with the ability to move up and down, which is an appropriate addition, although the game does little to capitalize on it. Most of the time staying near the bottom is the best choice, and the very few times needing to move vertically to avoid the occasional boss attack or flying asteroids left me wanting the game to have more waves that required it. The ship is also locked by an invisible plane, so moving it lower to pick up the loads of drumsticks and coins that fall to the bottom is an outright no-go. They'll be sent flying about constantly, and thanks to how fast and the different angles they'll go, a vast majority of them will be completely out of reach, even if you're playing with a mouse. Keyboard and controller players don't have a way at all to compensate for their lower speed. There's no reason for the mouse to be able to go so much faster than the others. It's just an outright unfair advantage. There's 2 more notable issues to gripe about, one being the lack of any continues or passwords to resume from where you left off. The game isn't awfully long, clocking in at about half an hour of play, but it's long enough to the point where a save system would have been a fitting inclusion. The other problem is with the change in design philosophy, because while there was also a shift from being a short arcade romp into a way more substantial one, it came with a lack of an option for having either or to pick from. The game now feeling like a complete experience instead of being a proof of concept comes without any option to play an endless version at all. This problem is 2-pronged. Score chasing is still the main and only goal, but now the skill ceiling has a cap that an alternate endless mode could have fixed. The game never progresses an awful lot in terms of difficulty, and since there's only a set distance, score pushing can theoretically only test player skill so far, because, surprisingly enough, this and a couple of other games under this studio have an actually existing competitive scene of sorts with leaderboards on the website. You would need to also have the game get progressively harder so that once a good enough skill threshold is reached, the only limiter to a score a player can get is their free time. Only having a set selection of levels to play is already a big limiter on the skill ceiling regardless. The other just as important thing to consider is how lacking an endless option severely hurts the replayability this game could have had by introducing it as a mode once the main game is finished. The challenge stays static with what you can potentially achieve, and there's a surprising quantity and quality in the different types of chicken waves here that could have been used repeatedly and wrung out for way more value than they have now, but there's only the 2 sets available between the 2 difficulty options. It'll come off as silly as wanting this much out of a chicken game of this nature, but I think doing this would have only served to massively increase longevity and player interaction. The inclusion of a veteran difficulty is appreciated, of course, but it still doesn't solve the previously stated issues. This game also came with DLC at some point, even with how rare it was in the early 2000s. The different Christmas ornaments and music are a nice coat of paint that mostly looks appropriate, even if it lacks the same amount of care put into it as the main game. He didn't go far enough with some of the sound effects and cutscenes that still, for some reason, remain unchanged from the base munching sounds when you collect mistletoe, for example. And I say he, as this game was still mainly produced by a single developer, the exact same who made the original Chicken Invaders, and the founder of the company this belongs to. The only things not made by Konstantinos Pruskas in both of these titles and their remasters were the music and sound effects for each. And having dug a bit deeper, all games under this studio seem to be his personal pet projects, as opposed to him founding a company that really grew with the employee count and expanded into an indie studio of sorts. And so, just like with the first Chicken Invaders, Chicken Invaders The Next Wave also received the same proper remaster treatment, keeping the original spirit intact while adding most quality of life additions needed. Essentially the same product, but made more accessible for later operating systems without any notable technical hiccups that can force later Windows users to turn off their computer sometimes just to close the application. Task Manager didn't even work for me in this case. The original Chicken Invaders 2 is very in vein with the first in the sense that they're both versions you should ignore in the favor of the remasters. There's almost no reason whatsoever to try the original versions, partly due to DirectX 7 being so poorly emulated on Windows 8 and onwards. 2 runs better than 1 in my experience, but any nostalgia and retro feel tied to the original versions is the sole reason to try those at all. The most notable gameplay changes for the remaster are how there's now the ability to continue from where you left off last. There's also now an auto-fire option by just holding down the fire button, both being fairly welcome and obvious changes for the better. It's just a shame that he didn't add an endless mode with the remaster, and the same for nerfing mouse speeds or adding a level select, but I won't be losing sleep over these. As a fun fact, the original Chicken Invaders 2 had an interesting beta, same with 2 other games under this studio. If you found a bug that hadn't been discovered, you outright got the game for free, with no strings attached. Although this piece of info here might need to be removed from the Chicken Invaders wiki, because I decided to reach out to the developer and got told this actually might have not been the case. I went ahead and came up with a few questions to ask for a short interview segment just for the sake of it. Question 1. How did it feel when you found out that Chicken Invaders garnered such a cult classic status? Does it have a cult classic status? Wow, such an honor. I guess in this case it's a difference in perspective, as Chicken Invaders never became something like a household name, but from what's available in places such as comment sections for videos of these games that also have view counts that are nothing to scoff at, they have a big amount of people reminiscing about playing Chicken Invaders when they were younger. Definitely helped how the first game was completely free to play, making the original very accessible to just about anyone. Question 2. How was Chicken Invaders first conceptualized? All space shooters of the time were based on metallic shapes, and I wanted something more organic that would have fluid animation and react much more convincingly to incoming fire. Color me impressed. It's odd how much consideration went into something so seemingly simple and random as space chickens, but it was inspired in a good choice as a result. The presentation is fairly respectable for the first installment, and while it's mostly the same assets brought over from that one to the sequel, it's still far from an ugly game. Question 3. Did you ever think much about the time period Chicken Invaders got released? Around the time it came out, the shoot-'em-up genre was thought by some to be waning in popularity, like people such as the president of Treasure at the time, Masato Maegawa. Not really. All Interaction Studios games are games that I myself wanted to play. Business considerations did not play into it. This is another fairly surprising comment, and honestly makes a lot of sense. Konstantinos doesn't try to make products he himself wouldn't enjoy, and he's really not out to make a big profit either, at the pretty reasonable price for Chicken Invaders 2, and presumably the other sequels he has listed on Steam as well don't already speak for themselves. This sort of developer mentality doesn't automatically mean what a developer likes is something most would even enjoy, but these games are as close to being pure passion projects as you can get. Question 4. What notable issues or mishaps occurred when you produced the very first game? The DOS version was being worked on but never saw the light of day, until the later UVEDX version, as it seems to essentially be the finished project. The DOS version was never completed, it was just a quick proof of concept. Back then, making it public, much less for sale, wasn't even considered a possibility. Question 5. The Wikipedia for Chicken Invaders states that the next wave had an initial release beta, and that if anyone found any bugs during it, they would receive a free copy of the game. Did it ever happen? I don't recall any beta for Chicken Invaders 2, and I don't think any free copies were sent out. Last, and most importantly, what are your favorite and least favorite forms of cooked chicken? Don't you realize that cooking chickens is what got humanity in trouble in the first place? Well, here's the end of the video. There's no straight minute of chicken puns this time around though. this video is the joke, and not to demean this game's quality. This right here was the very first comment I've ever gotten that had someone asking me to make a specific video. And when I first started doing this, I promised myself I'd absolutely do one on the first game I ever got asked to cover by a commenter. Tough luck for everyone else who sees this years from now, but I also said to do this as a one-time thing, and this was the one that ended up being asked for. ABID-JL6RI. I hope I made your day. Hey, suggestions are still valid, but the one-way ticket to getting something covered with absolute certainty is gone. A fart in the hurricane. Until next time.